Welcome to Lesson 2.5, Interactions between American Indians and Europeans. By the end of this lesson, we're going to look at how and why interactions between various European nations and American Indians changed over time. So this unit is looking at what's called a CCOT, change in continuity over time. What transformed about the relationship, and did anything stay the same? So initially, we're going to look at the context, the first context between Europeans and American Indians. And that contact, regardless of which European nations or native nations are involved, generally follows the pattern of accommodation and then conflict. So let's start with accommodation. Accommodation means that the two cultures were able to find some sort of relationship or coexistence. And that usually occurred because when the Europeans arrived to the New World, whether it was the Spanish who arrived in the Caribbean and had pretty much run out of supplies that they needed, or settlers arrived in Jamestown or New England and didn't have supplies and didn't know what they were doing, native people assisted them, helped them survive, make it through those first couple years in order to become stabilized. Once those European communities became more stable, then trade was introduced between the Europeans who brought trade goods that the natives had never seen before and wanted, and the natives who had goods the Europeans had never seen before and wanted. And this was a willful exchange of goods between both sides that was mutually beneficial for them. However, that relationship of accommodation could not last indefinitely. And conflict begins to emerge as more and more Europeans arrive in the New World. And those small initial settlements begin to grow as populations begin to grow. And that means that Europeans are now taking over more land that the natives wanted to use. And land becomes very important because land is, at its essence, essential for survival. Europeans and natives both need to farm the land. The natives and Europeans both hunt on the land. That's how they feed their people. That's how they sustain their populations. So it's a zero-sum game. As more Europeans are taking land away from natives, that means native cultures are struggling to feed their own people, which they will not tolerate. The other thing that causes conflict is a clash of cultures. As trade increases and we see goods introduced into Native American cultures from European, as well as things like religion, which are more intangible, we see a transformation within Native American cultures to assimilate and incorporate more European aspects. And for some Native Americans, they didn't like that change from traditional practices or beliefs. They believed, rightly so, that it was undermining the integrity of their traditional culture. That will cause conflict as well. So these alliances that will form, there are political alliances that form between Europeans and American Indians. And both sides enter into these alliances because once again, they find them mutually beneficial. Initially, Europeans needed native alliances in order to survive. They're in a place where they've never been before. They don't know the lay of the land. They don't know the other people there. So they look to native nations that were welcoming and that would help them as they established a foothold in the New World. Little did the natives know what that was going to result in. But European nations also saw a benefit in aligning with certain Native American groups for their own benefit. For example, the French aligned with some Indian nations who were better at fur trapping than others, or more willing to trap, I should say. The Spanish in Florida aligned with the Seminole people and armed them and encouraged them to attack the English colonists in Georgia and the southern colonies as kind of a Spanish gotcha to the English who were now colonizing lands that the Spanish were eyeing. And they didn't have to directly confront the English. They could do so through their Native American partners. Native Americans also saw a benefit, though, in these alliances for Europeans, because Europeans could provide weapons and gunpowder to Native nations for their intertribal conflicts, which means Native nation versus Native nation. And we cannot fool ourselves to think that all Native people were blissful and happy and got along in the New World before the arrival of Europeans. There was conflict that stemmed from, again, land usage or hunting grounds or some sense of superiority among Native people. So there was conflict that was there. A lot of it had been resolved as they had established like hunting grounds or farming grounds separate from each other. But when the Europeans arrive and bring new weapons, that reignites those conflicts. And a lot of times the conflicts get reunited because this happens. Europeans land on the coast. Their populations get larger. They push their way into native lands, forcing natives to either move further into other native tribe lands further inward or to expand their hunting ground and farming ground to make up for what they've lost to the Europeans. So as the Europeans push westward in their settlement, that pushes native nations westward into already existing native nations. That causes friction and conflict. And the Europeans certainly encourage that conflict because if you think about it, two native nations go to war with each other, they're going to both be destabilized by the end of that and weaken. And the Europeans can come in and take advantage of the weakened state of the victors. The other thing that it does is native nations war with each other using European weapons. As tribal communities are devastated, that opens up more land for European settlement. So in essence, Europeans said to natives, here, take guns, kill each other. It makes our job much easier to take what we need from you. Okay, so let's take a look at the conflicts between the British and Native Americans specifically. And again, we're talking about conflicts that came over land that would be used by both sides for farming and for hunting, as well as a cultural infusion of European culture into Native culture that natives found destabilizing. The example we're going to look at is called Metacom's War, or sometimes you'll see it referred to as King Philip's War. And this was the first of a number of Indian wars and big Indian wars that are going to take place in New England around the colony of Plymouth, where the Pilgrims were. So as you remember, when the Pilgrims arrived, the native people assisted them and helped them survive their first couple years. Once they became established, the Pilgrims began taking more native lands, but they also began allowing natives who wanted to convert to Puritan beliefs. And they had these things called praying towns that natives could live in if they adopted a Puritan English lifestyle. So unlike the Spanish who forced conversion for the Puritans, natives had to make the choice to do it, but it still undermined native culture and native traditions. When the leader of the Wampanoag Native Nation, who was named Metacom, demanded an English into these practices, Metacom was rebuffed by the English. He was referred to, by the way, by English settlers as King Philip. They liked to Anglinize or change names to English names, and Metacom was a native name. So King Philip, Metacom, same individual. We're going to use his native name out of respect because that's how he would identify himself. So he told the English, you need to cut out this conversion of my people. You need to stay off our lands or we're going to have problems. This is our territory and you're encroaching on it. When the English refused to do so, some violence broke out between native people and English settlers over disputes about land and livestock, and that quickly escalated into a conflict between the Wampanoag people led by Metacom and the Puritan settlers of New England. In the end, Metacom was killed by the Puritans. He was shot and killed by a Puritan soldier. And without his leadership, the war and the natives' alliances quickly crumbled apart. And 14 months after it started, Metacom's war was over. The surviving native people met a pretty brutal fate at the hands of the Puritan Christians. A lot of them, thousands of them, the Puritans enslaved and sold to the plantations in the British West Indies, and sold Native American people out of New England down into slavery in the Caribbean. Those that managed to escape being killed or enslaved moved further westward to the very edge of the colony on what was considered the frontier. The impact of that was devastating, and it marked the end of much organized Native American resistance to British colonial rule. On the other hand, let's go down to the Southwest United States to Spanish territory. What they called New Spain today is Arizona, New Mexico. And the Pueblo people lived in that region. These were the people, if you remember, that adopted maize cultivation early, but became semi-nomadic after a drought occurred. The Pueblo had been under Spanish control for 100 years, but the Spanish were pretty lenient with the Pueblo. As long as they publicly proclaimed Catholicism, what they privately did in their own homes as far as religious practice was tolerated. However, new Spanish friars coming into that region 100 years later said, no, this is unacceptable. You must be Catholic through and through. And so the Spanish friars ordered the soldiers to start destroying Pueblo religious artifacts, and they even arrested Pueblo religious leaders and publicly executed them as a warning about practicing their native religious beliefs. It should be noted the Spanish soldiers, the leader of the Spanish soldiers, said, we shouldn't do this. If you start messing with people's faith, we're going to have a backlash and we're going to have problems. The friars, not wanting to listen to him, ordered him excommunicated or kicked out of the Catholic Church and then executed. So that shows you the power that Spanish religious leaders had over the state and the military. So the Pueblo people, shocked by this attack on their culture, were organized by a native named Pope, who organized various Pueblo nations, not just the ones immediately impacted, but a much larger scale, under the noses of the Spanish, who never realized he was doing this, into an organized resistance that's called the Pueblo Revolt, or Pope's Revolt specifically. And the Pueblo actually managed to push the Spanish out of the Southwest. They regained their territory for about a decade and were able to self-govern again. 10 years later, the Spanish came back with reinforcements and re-entered Pueblo's lands. By then, Pope had disappeared. We don't know what happened to him, but the Pueblo, feeling a little bit more disorganized, negotiated with the Spanish, and they came to an agreement where the Pueblo would be under Spanish rule, but have a degree of autonomy and self-government. No other native people negotiated that within the Spanish Empire, where they did have a limited degree of freedom. And so the Pueblo revolt became an example of a subjugated people. The Spanish pushed down and tried to destroy their culture. The people resisted, found independence, and then negotiated an uneasy truce with the Spanish to be able to maintain their culture, but also Spain got to maintain their political control of the region. So if we take a look at our objective one more time, remember, we're looking why interactions between European nations and American Indians changed over time, from those earliest days of settlement through things like Metacom's War and the Pueblo Revolt. How and why did things change in the Native European relationship? And that's all for lesson 2.5.